My name is Doctor Samuel Bellamy. I am 87 years old. I am, to my profound and lasting regret, the last surviving senior physicist from the Atomic Energy Commission's Division of Special Projects. The others are all gone now. Cancer took most of them. The irony of that is not lost on me. We spent our lives chasing the fire of the atom, and in the end, its slow, quiet burn came for us all. All except me. I live in a sterile, climate-controlled apartment in a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona. The air here is dry and clean. The nurses are kind. They bring me my meals and my medications on a precise schedule. It is a quiet, orderly, and deeply pleasant place to wait for death. But the quiet here is a normal quiet. It is the quiet of polite society, of well-oiled machinery, of the absence of loud noise. It is nothing like the other quiet, the real quiet, the one I have carried inside me for 65 years. I'm not recording this. I am writing it down by hand with an old fountain pen on heavy government surplus bond paper that I requisitioned when I retired. I don't trust recordings. Sound can be altered. Tapes can be erased. I trust ink. I trust the physical impression of a thought onto a page. My hand trembles as I write. A combination of old age and old fears. My apartment has a large picture window that looks out over a beautifully manicured golf course. But I keep the blinds drawn. The bright, open space makes me nervous. I prefer the dim, controlled light of my small desk lamp. It feels safer. It feels contained. For more than 6 decades, I have honored the security oaths I swore. I took the truth of what happened in the Nevada desert in the spring of 1957, and I locked it away in the deepest, most secure vault I have, the silent, compartmentalized chambers of my own mind. They made it easy to stay quiet. The official report was a masterpiece of plausible fiction. The promotions, the accolades, the quiet, comfortable life they gave me, it was all a reward for my silence, a gilded cage. I am breaking my silence now because I am dying. The doctors, with their gentle, practiced sympathy, tell me I have a few months left. A tumor in my brain, inoperable. Another irony, a physicist, a man who lived his life in the world of the tangible and the measurable, being undone by a chaotic, uncontrolled growth in the seed of his own consciousness. And I have decided that I will not take this secret to the grave. It is too heavy. It has poisoned my life, my memories, my very relationship with the world. My internal baggage, you see, is not one of guilt. It is one of profound, abject, and soul-shattering terror. I was one of the lead scientists who designed the weapon. It was my equations on the blackboard. It was my name on the final design proposal. And what that weapon did, what it created, it was not supposed to be possible. It broke a law of physics we didn't even know existed. The catalyst for this confession is my own mortality. I have laid awake at night, every night for 65 years, and I've seen their faces. The faces of the 5 men inside monitoring post Delta 4. I need to tell their story. I need the world to know what the Atomic Energy Commission buried under the sands of the Nevada test site. What we created in our arrogant pursuit of a bigger, more efficient explosion. People need to know about the test we called Operation Tacit. It's a Latin word. It means, it is silent. We thought it was a clever, poetic code name. We had no idea how literal, how absolute it would become. People need to know why, at the exact moment of detonation, a monitoring post located 20 miles from ground zero, a post that should have been rocked by a hurricane of sound and fury, went completely and utterly silent. Not just their radios, the post itself, the very air around it. And they need to understand that the horror we unleashed that day was not one of fire and radiation. It was the horror of a world without sound. A world where a scream was just a gasp for air that no one, not even God, could hear. I was 22 years old, a fresh-faced prodigy out of MIT, and I still believed that what we were doing was for the greater good, a necessary shield against the darkness of the Soviet Union. I believed we were creating a weapon to end all wars. That was my first and most terrible mistake. The journey to the zone of silence did not begin with a flight or a drive. It began in a place of pure theory, in a classroom at Los Alamos National Laboratory. I was a young man then, barely old enough to drink, but my mind was a place of sharp, beautiful equations. I was part of a team, a collection of the brightest minds the AEC could gather, and our task was simple and terrifying: to reinvent the atomic bomb. The early bombs, the ones we dropped on Japan, were clumsy, inefficient things. They converted less than 2% of their fissile material into explosive energy. Our job was to do better, to create a smaller, lighter, and vastly more powerful weapon. A true city killer. And the key, we believed, was in the compression. The initial chemical explosion that squeezed the plutonium core into a critical mass. My contribution, my terrible, beautiful idea, was a new type of explosive lens. A configuration of charges that would create a perfectly spherical, perfectly uniform implosion wave. In theory, on the blackboard, it was a work of art. In practice, we needed to test it. That test was Operation Tacit. The weapon was a prototype, a device codenamed Morpheus. The name was a dark joke from one of the senior physicists, a reference to the Greek god of dreams, because my implosion wave was so perfect, so silent on paper, that it should theoretically induce a state of near-perfect energy conversion. The test was scheduled for May of 1957 at the Nevada test site, a vast, empty expanse of desert, a place where we could unleash hell without, we thought, anyone getting hurt. The journey to the test site was a journey into a different America. We flew from the green, tree-lined hills of New Mexico to the raw, sun-baked desolation of the Mojave. The world outside the window of the military transport plane transformed from a place of life to a place of stark, brutal emptiness. The desert stretched to the horizon in every direction, a landscape of pale dirt, jagged rock, and hardy, spiteful-looking scrub brush. It was a place that felt ancient, alien, and utterly indifferent to the small, foolish games of men. Our base of operations was at a facility known as Frenchman Flat. It was a small, temporary city of prefabricated buildings, Quonset huts, and observation towers, dropped into the middle of nowhere. The air was hot and dry, and a constant wind blew fine, abrasive dust into everything. The atmosphere was a strange mixture of a college campus and a military barracks. We were scientists, physicists, engineers, but we were working for the military, under the watchful eye of the AEC. There was an excitement in the air, a palpable electric buzz of anticipation. We were on the verge of a great leap forward. We were gods, about to create a new kind of star on Earth. My role in the days leading up to the test was to work with the monitoring teams. My equations predicted the weapon's yield, the blast radius, the thermal pulse. Their job was to measure it, to see if my beautiful theories matched the ugly, violent reality. The landscape around Ground Zero was dotted with small, hardened concrete monitoring posts, bunkers stuffed with sensors, cameras, and telemetry equipment. I was assigned to liaise with the crew of monitoring post Delta 4. It was located 20 miles from the planned Ground Zero, a safe distance, we thought, for a manned post. Its crew was a team of 5 AEC technicians, good men, all of them veterans of previous tests. Their commander was a man named Gus O'Connell. He was a classic Cold War archetype, the commander, a by-the-book ex-Marine who believed in God, his country, and the unquestionable authority of the Atomic Energy Commission. He was a good man, but his worldview was a simple, binary thing: us and them. Right and wrong. I spent the day before the test with them, going over their equipment, double-checking the calibration of their seismographs and radiation counters. Gus and I had a long conversation that evening, a building dread moment that I dismissed at the time, but which has haunted me ever since. We were sitting outside the bunker, watching the sun set over the desert, turning the distant mountains a deep, bruised purple. Gus was a true believer, not in conspiracies, but in the land itself. "You know, Doc," he said to me, his voice a low rumble, "the Paiute, the tribes that used to live out here, they had stories about this place. They called this part of the desert the place where the sky sleeps. They said it was a holy place, a place where the barrier between our world and the spirit world was thin. They said if you made a loud noise out here, the spirits wouldn't like it. They'd steal the sound, a punishment for disturbing their sleep." He chuckled, a dry, dusty sound. "Crazy talk, I know. Just folklore?" I smiled politely, a young, arrogant scientist listening to the superstitious ramblings of an old soldier. I tried to explain to him the geology of the basin, the way the unique rock formations could create strange acoustic echoes, a rational scientific explanation for the local legends. He just nodded, not really listening. "Maybe so, Doc," he said, looking out at the vast, silent desert. "But sometimes late at night when the wind is just right, this place gets quiet. A different kind of quiet. A heavy quiet, like it's holding its breath, waiting for something." The first direct anomaly, the sign that things were about to go horribly wrong, happened just before dawn on the day of the test. I was in the main control bunker at Frenchman Flat, a massive underground concrete room filled with scientists and generals, all staring at a bank of monitors. The countdown was proceeding smoothly. The entire area was a web of communication links, radio channels, and hardwired phone lines. At T-minus 30 minutes, we did a final communications check with all monitoring posts. Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, all reported in, their voices a clear, steady crackle of static and professionalism. Then the controller called, "Delta 4, this is Control. Do you copy?" There was a long moment of silence, just the hiss of an open radio channel. "Delta 4, this is Control. Respond." Nothing. The controller tried again. "O'Connell, do you read me?" Silence. A ripple of concern went through the control room. A communications failure at this stage was a serious problem. The general in charge of the test, a stern, impatient man named General Markman, got on the line himself. "Gus, this is Markman. What the hell is going on out there? Talk to me." The only reply was the empty, lifeless hiss of the radio. We tried the hard-wired phone line. It was dead. All communication with the Delta 4 had been completely and inexplicably severed. There was a frantic 10-minute debate. Should we scrub the test? A communications failure was a major safety violation, but the pressure to proceed was immense. Senators had flown in. The press was waiting. A delay would be a logistical and political nightmare. I looked at the radiation telemetry from Delta 4's automated sensors. They were still broadcasting. The sensors were working perfectly. It was just the comms. "It's probably just a faulty transmitter, General," I said, my voice full of a confidence I didn't feel. "Their equipment is old. The automated telemetry is still live. They're fine." It was the most logical explanation, and it was the explanation everyone wanted to hear. The general made the call. The test would proceed. The countdown resumed. The final 10 seconds were a surreal, silent movie in the control room, everyone holding their breath. At 0, a brilliant, searing, silent flash of white light filled the main monitor screen, a live feed from a camera miles away, the birth of our new star. A wave of triumphant cheering and applause erupted in the control room. Men were shaking hands, clapping each other on the back. I felt a surge of pride, of accomplishment. My equations had worked, but my eyes were fixed on the telemetry monitor for Delta 4. At the exact, precise nanosecond of detonation, every single one of its data streams, radiation, pressure, temperature, flatlined. Not a gradual decline, not a spike, and then a drop. They all went from a steady, normal reading to absolute zero, instantly, as if the post and everything in it had simply ceased to exist. Our destination, the isolated setting of monitoring post Delta 4, had just vanished from the world. The gates were not open. They had been vaporized. And I, in my arrogance, had just given the order that condemned 5 men to a fate far, far worse than death. The initial, triumphant atmosphere in the control bunker evaporated the moment Delta 4's telemetry went dead. The cheering and backslapping subsided into a tense, confused silence. General Markman stared at the flatline monitors, his face a grim, stony mask. The assumption was immediate and horrifying. The yield of the Morpheus device had been far, far greater than my calculations predicted. A yield miscalculation was the polite term. What it meant was that I had made a terrible mistake, and that monitoring post Delta 4 and the 5 men inside it had been vaporized, wiped from the face of the earth by a fire hotter than the surface of the sun. The weight of that guilt was a physical thing, a crushing pressure on my chest. The faces of Gus O'Connell and his team flashed in my mind. I had told the general they were fine. I had assured him it was just a faulty radio. My words had signed their death certificates. The methodical process of dealing with the accident began immediately. A radiological disaster protocol was initiated. The entire test area was locked down. For 2 days, a heavy, leaden dread hung over Frenchman Flat as we waited for the initial deadly wave of radiation to subside. My own mental state was a wreck. I was confined to my quarters, where I went over my equations again and again, a frantic, desperate search for the flaw, the single, misplaced decimal point that had caused the catastrophe. But I couldn't find one. My numbers were perfect. The theory was sound. It didn't make sense. On the 3rd day, the decision was made to send in a recovery team. It was not a rescue mission. It was a mission to survey the damage, to measure the catastrophic radiation levels at the new, much larger Ground Zero, and to confirm, if possible, the annihilation of Delta 4. I insisted on going with them. It was my penance, my responsibility. General Markman was against it, but I was the only one who knew the exact specifications of the monitoring equipment. My presence was, unfortunately, necessary, so I found myself squeezed into the back of a specially designed, lead-lined M113 armored personnel carrier, a claustrophobic, windowless steel box. The team consisted of 4 men from the AEC's Radiological Safety Unit, all clad in heavy, cumbersome, silver-colored radiation suits, their faces hidden behind the thick glass of their helmets. They were a somber, silent crew. The journey out to the former site of Delta 4 was a slow, lumbering crawl across a landscape that had been transformed into a vision of hell. The desert floor was scorched black, littered with the skeletal remains of scrub brush. The air, even filtered through the APC's advanced systems, tasted metallic and dead. Our dosimeters clicked away with a steady, sickening rhythm, a sound like tiny, invisible insects chewing on our lives. As we got closer to the 20-mile mark, where the post should have been, the anomaly, the true wrongness of the environment, began to manifest. The first sign was the heat, or rather, the lack of it. The temperature inside our APC was a steady, climate-controlled 70 degrees. but the external sensors showed the ambient temperature dropping rapidly. We were in the heart of the Nevada desert, hours after a nuclear detonation, and the temperature outside was plummeting. It went from 110 degrees to 80 to 60. By the time we were within a mile of the site, it was 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground outside was covered in a thin, impossible layer of frost. The second sign was the silence. Our APC was a noisy machine. The roar of its diesel engine, the clatter of its tracks, the hum of its air filters, the constant crackle of the radio. But as we passed a certain invisible boundary, all of that sound changed. It didn't stop. It became muted, dampened, as if we had been plunged underwater. The roar of the engine became a soft, distant hum. The crackle of the radio faded to a faint hiss. The driver, a young sergeant, yelled over his shoulder, his voice sounding flat and distant. "What the hell? It's like someone stuffed cotton in my ears." We were all feeling it. A strange, physical pressure on our eardrums. A feeling of profound, unnatural quiet. We reached the coordinates where Delta 4 should have been, and we stopped. We were all expecting to see a new, massive crater of fused glass, a smoking, radioactive hole in the ground. But that's not what we saw. The monitoring post was still there. It was completely intact. The thick, reinforced concrete bunker was sitting in the middle of the frosted desert, seemingly untouched. There was no blast damage, no scorching. The paint on the steel door wasn't even blistered. It was impossible. A structure 20 miles from a nuclear blast should have been scoured from existence. But here it was, perfectly preserved, sitting in the center of a circle of frozen ground under a dead, silent sky. The sight was so wrong, so profoundly at odds with the laws of physics, that for a long moment, no one spoke. We just stared through the thick quartz viewing ports of the APC, our minds struggling to reconcile the impossible image before us. The team leader, a grim, humorless man named Major Harris, made the call. "We're going in." The ramp of the APC lowered with a barely audible hydraulic hiss. We stepped out, our heavy boots making no sound on the frosted, crunchy sand. The silence was absolute. It was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered all noise. There was no wind. The air was unnaturally still. I looked up at the sky. It was a clear, brilliant, cloudless blue. But it felt wrong. The quality of the light was strange, flat, and shadowless, as if it were being filtered through a thick, invisible lens. The feeling of being watched was immense. I felt like a microbe under a vast cosmic microscope. We approached the steel door of the bunker. There was no sign of forced entry, no damage. But the door was slightly ajar, open by just a few inches. A sliver of darkness was visible within. Harris gestured with his hand, and two of his men took up positions on either side of the door, their weapons, radiation-shielded rifles, held at the ready. Harris and I approached the door. He put his gloved hand on the cold steel and pushed. It swung open without a sound, the heavy hinges moving in perfect, oily silence. We raised our flashlights, their beams cutting through the gloom. And we saw them, the crew of Delta 4, the direct contact with the past tragedy. They were all there. Gus O'Connell was standing by the main console, his hand reaching for a large red button. Another technician was sitting in a chair, a ceramic coffee mug halfway to his lips. A third was looking up at a pressure gauge on the wall, his brow furrowed in concentration. A fourth was writing in a logbook, his pen poised just above the paper. The fifth man was standing by the door, his hand on the handle, his mouth open as if in a shout. They were all frozen, not dead, not burned. They were held in a perfect, crystalline moment of time, like insects trapped in amber. Their skin was pale, but it had color. Their eyes were open, and they seemed to be looking, to be seeing. They were statues of flesh and blood, captured in the last second of their lives, and tucked under the console, next to O'Connell's frozen feet, was a single, potent object. A small, reel-to-reel tape recorder, the kind they used to record verbal logs. The tape was still threaded, and the red record button was lit, glowing with a soft, steady, and impossibly patient light. This was the cliffhanger, the black box from a flight that had never crashed. It held the only record of the last moments of Delta IV, and the terrifying implication was that whatever had happened to them, it was still happening. Our first night in the zone of silence was not marked by the setting of the sun, but by the moment we crossed the threshold into monitoring post Delta IV. We were no longer a recovery team. We were explorers in a new and terrifyingly alien world, a world where the fundamental laws of physics had been suspended. The 5 of us stood in the doorway of the bunker for what felt like an eternity, our minds reeling from the impossible sight of the frozen crew. The interior of the bunker was a perfect, silent tableau of the last second of a normal day. A wisp of steam, now a solid, unmoving crystalline structure, hung above the coffee mug of the man sitting at the desk. A half-eaten sandwich sat on a plate, a single perfect bite mark visible. The air was cold and still, carrying the faint, familiar smells of stale coffee, ozone from the electronics, and the faint, coppery scent of human sweat. But all of it was trapped, held in stasis, under the crushing weight of the absolute silence. Major Harris, a man whose entire career was built on procedure and control, was the first to try and impose order on the chaos. He spoke, but his voice was gone. I saw his mouth move, his jaw work, but no sound came out. He looked startled, confused. He touched his throat, then tried again, shouting this time, his face turning red with effort, the veins in his neck standing out. The result was the same, a silent, desperate mouthing of words. We were all trapped in a vacuum, but a vacuum we could breathe in. This was our first personal experience with the true nature of the anomaly. The silence wasn't just an absence of noise, it was a negation of it. The false alarms began immediately, products of our own disoriented minds. In the dead quiet, every internal sound of my own body became a roaring cacophony. I could hear the thudding of my own heart, the rasp of my own breathing inside my helmet, the faint, high-pitched whine of the electronics in my radiation suit. Every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision made me jump. A shadow cast by my own flashlight would seem to leap and writhe, and for a heart-stopping moment, I would think one of the frozen men had moved. We were all on edge, our nerves stretched taut, our brains struggling to function in a world devoid of one of its most fundamental sensory inputs. We tried to communicate using hand signals, a clumsy, frustrating pantomime. Harris pointed at the frozen men, then made a gesture for us to check their vitals. One of his men, a young corporal named Jensen, approached the man with the coffee mug. He reached out a gloved hand to touch the man's neck, to feel for a pulse. The moment his glove made contact with the man's skin, Jensen recoiled, his own body jerking back as if he had received a powerful electric shock. He stumbled backward, his silent face a mask of pain and confusion. The escalation from this baseline of fear and confusion to something far more sinister happened when one of the other men, a specialist named Riley, lost his composure. He was a big, loud, boisterous man, and the silence was clearly getting to him more than the rest of us. In a fit of pure frustration, he turned to the main steel console and struck it a powerful, glancing blow with a heavy wrench he was carrying. The impact should have produced a loud, ringing clang of metal on metal. Instead, there was nothing. A dead, silent collision. but the effect was instantaneous and devastating. All 5 of us in the recovery team were crippled by a sudden agonizing wave of pure, undiluted psychic pain. It was not a sound. It was a feeling. A white-hot spike of pure agony that exploded in the center of my brain. It was the worst migraine I've ever experienced, multiplied by 1,000. It was the feeling of a dentist's drill on a raw nerve. But the nerve was my soul. We all collapsed to our knees, clutching our heads, our faces contorted in silent screams. The pain was so intense, so overwhelming, that for a few seconds I thought I was going to black out. This was the direct contact. The moment we understood the true, horrifying rules of this place. The silence was not an absence. It was a field. A physical, tangible field that converted kinetic energy. The energy of sound, the energy of impact, directly into a mental assault. The louder the potential sound, the greater the kinetic energy, the more intense the psychic pain. We had thought we were in a quiet place. We were wrong. We were in the loudest place in the universe, but the sound was being channeled directly into our minds. The frozen crew of Delta 4. They hadn't been killed by the bomb's sound wave. They had been flash-fried by it. The hurricane of sound from the blast, 1,000,000 decibels of raw kinetic energy, had hit this field and been converted into a single, infinitely powerful psychic blast that had stopped their brains, their hearts, their very atoms in a single, frozen moment. They were held in the grip of the echo of that first, terrible, silent sound. The cliffhanger, the indisputable proof that validated our new, terrifying theory, came moments later. As we slowly, painfully, picked ourselves up from the floor, the agony in our heads receding to a dull, throbbing ache, Riley, the man who had struck the console, did not get up. He was lying on the floor, his body twitching in a silent grand mal seizure. His eyes were rolled back in his head, and a thin trickle of blood, dark and thick, was leaking from his nose and ears. The psychic feedback from the blow of his wrench had been too much. It had shattered his mind. He was the first casualty of the silence, and we knew, with a certainty that was colder and more terrifying than any radiation reading, that we were trapped. Trapped in a place where the slightest misstep, the slightest loud noise, a dropped tool, a shouted word, could kill us. We were forced to move in a state of absolute preternatural slowness, every movement a careful, deliberate ballet, to avoid the terrible, silent pain of making a sound. We were prisoners of the quiet. Driven by the horrifying spectacle of Riley's silent seizure, our mission objective shifted once again. It was no longer about recovery or assessment. It was about survival. And survival, in this new, predatory environment, required understanding. We had to launch an investigation, not into what happened to O'Connell's crew, but into the nature of the field that now held us captive. I was a scientist. Harris was a soldier. Our training, our professional instincts, were our only defense against the rising tide of panic. We had to fall back on what we knew. We had to gather data. We had to form a hypothesis. It was the only way to keep our own minds from shattering. Our investigation was a study in agonizing slow-motion ballet. We communicated with a series of slow, deliberate hand signals we developed on the spot. We moved through the small bunker with the exaggerated, dreamlike care of bomb disposal experts, our every footstep placed with a gentle, practiced precision to minimize the kinetic energy of the impact. The slightest scuff of a boot on the concrete floor would send a faint, sharp needle of pain lancing through our skulls. We had become living seismographs, our own brains the delicate instruments measuring the deadly vibrations of our own movements. The near misses were constant. The young corporal, Jensen, stumbled at one point, his arm knocking against a metal filing cabinet. The silent impact sent a wave of nausea and vertigo through all of us. A shared psychic blow that left us dizzy and disoriented for a full minute. We learned to treat every object, every surface, as if it were coated in a high explosive that was triggered by touch. Our search for the central artifact, the key to understanding this madness, led us inevitably to the one object in the room that was still active, still glowing with a semblance of normal pre-event life. The small, reel-to-reel tape recorder next to O'Connell's frozen form. It was the only thing in the room that seemed to be exempt from the stasis field. Its red record light was a tiny, defiant beacon in the silent, frozen tomb. Getting to it was a nightmare. I had to slowly, carefully, step over the frozen legs of one of the technicians, my own movement so slow and controlled that my muscles began to cramp with the strain. I knelt down beside O'Connell's body, my own heart a slow, heavy drum in my chest. The recorder was a standard issue AEC model. The tape was a standard 5-inch reel. But there was something wrong with it. The tape spools, which should have been turning, were perfectly still. Yet the record light was on. It was a paradox. How could it be recording if the tape wasn't moving? This was the artifact, deliberately hidden in plain sight, its importance masked by its impossible nature. I knew, with the unshakable certainty of a scientist who has just seen a ghost, that this was the key. This was the black box. My investigation now had a singular focus. I had to access the contents of this tape. Major Harris, his face grim behind his faceplate, gave me a slow, deliberate nod. This was my area of expertise. He and his remaining man stood guard, their rifles held in a slow-motion ready stance, watching the frozen men as if they might, at any moment, spring back to life. I turned my attention to the recorder. I couldn't simply press the play button. The sudden, clunky mechanical action would be a kinetic explosion, a psychic shotgun blast to our minds. I had to disassemble it, piece by agonizing piece. The process of taking apart that small machine was the most intense, high-stakes piece of engineering I have ever performed. I used a small, specialized toolkit from my suit, each turn of a screwdriver performed with the slow, painstaking precision of a watchmaker. Each tiny screw, once loosened, had to be gently, carefully lifted from its housing and placed on a soft cloth on the floor. A single drop screw could have been catastrophic. It took me what felt like hours. The silence of the bunker was absolute, broken only by the faint, slow rasp of my own breathing. As I worked, I could feel the field around us, a living, breathing presence. It felt like I was performing surgery on a living patient, and the slightest slip of my knife would cause the patient to wake up and kill me. Finally, I had the back panel off. I could see the internal mechanics of the machine. And I saw the truth. The recorder had been modified. The drive motor had been disconnected. The playback head was wired directly to a small, custom-built electronic component I didn't recognize, a small metal box with a single glowing vacuum tube. The tape wasn't a recording medium for sound. It was an antenna, a passive antenna, absorbing something. And the device was converting that something into what? With infinite care, I disconnected the strange component and gently pried the reel of tape from the machine. I held it in my gloved hand. It was just a reel of magnetic tape, but it felt heavy. It felt full. The direct contact with the recorded past would have to wait. But the investigation had led me to the mystery's heart. Now, for the cliffhanger. As I held the reel, my eyes scanned the console in front of O'Connell's frozen body, and I saw a single sheet of paper held down by a frozen-in-place clipboard. It was the last page from the station's log, and on it was a single, frantic, handwritten message scrawled by O'Connell in the last second of his life, his pen still poised over the final, unfinished word. The message was not addressed to control. It was addressed to God, or to whoever might find them. And it was the first stunning revelation that recontextualized everything. It explained what they were doing in that last fatal second. I leaned in close, my helmet light illuminating the page. The scrawled message read, "It's not a secondary effect. The silence is the weapon. Morpheus wasn't a failure. It worked. It's not a bomb. It's a cage. We're trying to turn it of." O'Connell's last unfinished message, "We're trying to turn it of," was a key that unlocked a new and even more terrifying chamber in this house of horrors. The silence wasn't an effect. It was the weapon itself. And they, the crew of Delta 4, had understood that in their final moments. They weren't just hapless victims caught in a blast wave. They were soldiers, fighting a war against a weapon they couldn't comprehend. And the red button Gus O'Connell's frozen finger was reaching for was not a panic button. It was an off switch. This entire act of our ordeal was now dedicated to one singular, terrifying purpose: absorbing the contents of the central artifact. But the artifact wasn't just the reel of tape I held in my hand. It was the entire bunker. It was O'Connell's last message, the modified recorder, the frozen tableau of the men themselves. It was a multi-layered puzzle, and I had to solve it before the silence solved us. The logbook, the one the frozen technician had been writing in, was our first text. I moved with agonizing slowness, a deep-sea diver moving against immense pressure, and gently lifted the pen from the man's frozen fingers. I then carefully slid the logbook from the desk. The pages were filled with the neat, blocky printing of a trained technician. The early entries were a verbatim transcript of their day: routine equipment checks, weather observations, bad jokes passed between crew members. It was a detailed, mundane record of the hours leading up to the test. I read the entries in a low whisper to Harris and Jensen, my voice a ghost in their helmets. Our private comms link a tiny bubble of sound in the vast, dead ocean of quiet. As I read their words, the ordinary human life of the bunker seemed to bleed into the present. I read an entry about O'Connell complaining that the coffee tasted like battery acid, and my eyes flickered to the frozen, steaming mug on the desk. I read a joke one of them had made about the heat, and I felt a phantom chill from the impossible frost outside. The past was not dead. It wasn't even past. It was frozen all around us, a constant, silent testament to the horror that had befallen them. The crucial entries began about an hour before the test. O'Connell had noted a strange, low-level atmospheric distortion on their long-range sensors, a phenomenon that wasn't showing up on our equipment back at Frenchman Flat. He described it as a visual shimmering, like a heat haze, but the ambient temperature is normal. This was the first hint of the field, the bubble of altered physics beginning to form. Then, 31 minutes before the detonation, the log recorded their communications failure. O'Connell wrote, "All comms links to control are dead. Radio, hardline, everything. It's not an equipment malfunction. It feels like the signal is being absorbed. There's no static, just nothing. The air itself feels dead." He was describing the formation of the zone of silence. The final entries, in the last minutes before the test, were a frantic, terrifying race against time. The log became a real-time transcript of their dawning comprehension. They began to notice the acoustic deadening inside the bunker. One of them dropped a wrench, and O'Connell noted, "Silent impact, no sound." But we all felt it, a jolt in our heads. They were experiencing the first faint whispers of the psychic pain. They were scientists and technicians. They began to take readings to form a hypothesis. They realized the shimmering they were seeing outside was the edge of a spherical field, and they were at its exact center. They were no longer a monitoring post. They were the specimen under the microscope. My own hands trembled as I read O'Connell's final desperate hypothesis, scrawled in the last minutes of his life. Bellamy's implosion lens. The spherical compression wave. It didn't just compress the plutonium core. It compressed space-time itself. It created a stable, localized acoustic vacuum. A bubble where the physics of sound have been inverted. Kinetic energy is not dissipating as sound waves. It's converting into another form of energy. A direct neuroelectrical assault. God help us. It's a psychic shockwave. He had figured it out. Gus O'Connell, the gruff ex-Marine, had solved the puzzle in the last 5 minutes of his life. He had understood my terrible, beautiful creation better than I did. The log then detailed their final, heroic act. They realized the field was being sustained by a resonant frequency generated by the weapon's primary detonation, and that their own bunker, with its massive power supply and radio antennas, was acting as a passive amplifier, a tuning fork that was keeping the field stable. The off switch O'Connell was reaching for was not to turn off a siren. It was a total power disconnect for the entire bunker, a desperate attempt to de-energize the tuning fork and collapse the cage. He was trying to save himself, and in doing so, he would have saved us from ever finding this place. The final log entry was a single chilling phrase, written moments before the main detonation, as he saw the countdown clock on his console nearing 0. The primary detonation will be the killing blow. The sound wave will be infinite. It's coming. That was it. The log ended. He knew the psychic shockwave was coming, and he was a fraction of a second too late to stop it. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. I looked over at his frozen form, at the determined, agonized look on his face, at his finger a centimeter from the button, and I was filled with a profound and terrible sense of awe. He was not a victim. He was a hero who had failed by the barest of margins. Now, for the reel of tape. I knew I couldn't play it, but I also knew, from O'Connell's log, that it was an antenna. It had been passively recording the ambient energy of the field. It was the only pure data sample of the silence itself. I held the reel in my hands. It was the single most dangerous object in the world, and it was my only way out. Harris, Jensen, and I were all trapped. Our comrade Riley was in a vegetative state on the floor. We could not walk out. The journey would take too long, and we would eventually make a mistake. A sound that would kill us. We could not call for help. We could not wait for a rescue that would not come, because they would not know how to enter the field without suffering the same fate. We were marooned on an island of silence, and as I looked at the logbook, at the frozen men, at the useless equipment, a single, terrifying, and game-changing idea began to form in my mind. It was a hypothesis born of desperation and scientific intuition. O'Connell was wrong about one thing. He thought the bunker was a passive amplifier. But what if it wasn't? That custom-built component in the recorder, the one with the glowing vacuum tube. What if it wasn't just a receiver? What if the bunker wasn't just a tuning fork? What if it was the projector? My new hypothesis, that the bunker was not an amplifier, but the projector of the silence, was a paradigm shift. It changed us from passive victims into potential combatants. But the enemy was not a creature or a soldier. The enemy was a concept, a bubble of broken physics. And the psychological war it waged upon us was one of slow, grinding attrition. A war fought against our own bodies, our own instincts, our own desperate need to make a sound. The entity, the silence itself, now aware of our presence, began to exert a more direct and personal pressure. The assault was tied directly to my own internal baggage, my identity as a scientist, a man of action and solutions, now rendered utterly impotent. The building dread began with a change in the field itself. It had been a neutral, static presence, but now it began to feel active. I would be standing perfectly still, holding my breath, and I would feel a faint, phantom vibration against my skin, a soft, psychic touch that had no physical source. It was the silence, probing us. It was like being in a dark room with a blind predator and feeling its whiskers brush against your cheek. It was an intimate, violating sensation that made my skin crawl. The silence was no longer just a cage. It was a cage with a curious and malevolent keeper. The manipulations escalated into full-blown waking nightmares, not of images, but of sensations. I would feel a sudden, intense, and utterly illusory sense of pressure on my chest, as if a great weight were pinning me down. I would feel a phantom itching on my back, in a place I could not possibly scratch without making a fatal, kinetic gesture. These were the labyrinth's new tools of torture. Tiny, insignificant physical discomforts that, in this environment, became monumental challenges. To scratch an itch, to shift your weight, to clear your throat. These simple, unconscious human acts were now life or death decisions. The silence was weaponizing my own biology against me. It was a psychological war fought on the battlefield of my own skin. Then, the direct contact began. The silence started to communicate, not with voices, but with pain. It was no longer just a reaction to our movements. It began to manifest spontaneously. We would be standing perfectly still, and a sudden, sharp spike of psychic agony would lance through our skulls, for no reason at all. It was a punishment, a warning, a reminder of its absolute power. It was the silence saying, "I am here. I am in control. Do not forget it." During one of these spontaneous attacks, I saw Major Harris, a man I had seen remain stoic and calm through unimaginable stress, begin to weep. Silent tears streamed down his face from behind his helmet's faceplate, his body rigid, his face a mask of pure agony as he fought to endure the invisible assault without crying out and making it worse. The silence was trying to break us, to drive us mad with a combination of sensory deprivation, physical torture, and the constant, crushing psychological weight of our own helplessness. Pushed to the brink of insanity by this relentless, invisible torment, I knew I had to act on my new hypothesis. It was a catastrophic, irreversible gamble, but it was the only move I had left. My theory was this: the device in the tape recorder was the focal point, the projector bulb for the field. The reel of tape was its antenna, drawing power from the ambient energy of the initial blast, which was still echoing somehow in this bubble of altered physics. And the entire bunker, with its network of wiring and metal consoles, was the projector lens, shaping and sustaining the field. If I was right, then O'Connell's plan to cut the power would have done nothing. The field was self-sustaining. But if I could reverse the polarity of the projector, I might be able to cause the field to collapse in on itself. It was a 1 in a billion shot, a desperate prayer based on a wild guess. But it was better than waiting to die. I communicated my plan to Harris and Jensen with a series of slow, agonizingly deliberate hand signals. I pointed to the recorder, then to the main power console. Then I made a sign for reversing a current. Harris stared at me for a long moment, his face a mask of exhausted despair. I could see the debate raging in his eyes. It was an insane plan. It could make things infinitely worse. It could kill us all instantly. But then he looked at Riley, still lying motionless on the floor, and he gave me a single, slow, deliberate nod. Permission granted. The mistake I was about to commit was not one of panic, but of pure, calculated, scientific desperation. I was about to perform open-heart surgery on a god, using a wrench and a prayer. I moved with a slowness that felt like geological time. Every gesture was a universe of risk. I had to reroute the main power conduit, bypass a series of breakers, and feed a high-voltage reverse polarity charge directly into the custom-built device from the tape recorder, which I had placed on the main console. The process took over an hour of holding my breath, of cramping muscles, of fighting off the waves of spontaneous psychic pain that the silence threw at us. Finally, it was ready. I stood before the main power breaker. This was the point of no return. I looked at Harris. He met my gaze and gave me a final, grim nod. I took a deep breath, a final silent prayer to a god I was no longer sure I believed in, and I threw the lever. The effect was not a blinding flash of light or a deafening roar. For a single, heart-stopping second, nothing happened. And then, a sound. The first real, physical sound we had heard since entering the zone. It was a low, guttural, tearing sound, like a giant piece of canvas being ripped in two. The air in the bunker shimmered, the visual distortion intensifying. The frozen men, O'Connell and his crew, began to vibrate, their bodies blurring at the edges. The psychic pressure in our heads became an unbearable, screaming crescendo. The silence was fighting back. It was collapsing, and it was trying to take us with it. The entire bunker groaned, not with the sound of metal, but with a sound that was somehow alive. A sound of a great, wounded creature giving its death cry. And as the psychic noise reached an impossible, world-shattering peak, my world and everything in it dissolved into a wave of pure, white, and mercifully silent agony. The white, silent agony was not an end. It was a transition. The immediate, disastrous consequence of my action was a complete and utter collapse of the localized reality inside the bunker. The point of no return was the moment I threw that switch, and the universe we had been trapped in folded in on itself. I was unconscious for a time. I don't know how long. My reawakening was a slow, painful crawl back to a world that was now filled, blessedly and terrifyingly, with sound. The first thing I heard was the high-pitched, insistent shriek of a smoke alarm. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning electronics. I opened my eyes. The bunker was a scene of utter devastation. The main console was a molten, blackened ruin. Wires hung from the ceiling, sparking and spitting. The bodies of O'Connell and his crew were gone. Not vaporized, not moved. They had simply vanished, as if they had been ghosts all along, their spectral forms tied to the existence of the field. When the field collapsed, they had collapsed with it. The silence that followed the initial chaos of my awakening was not the profound, predatory silence of the zone. It was a normal, terrestrial silence, the simple absence of loud noise, punctuated by the crackle of dying fires and the groan of stressed metal. The dread that filled me now was not the dread of the unknown, but the dread of the known. I had done it. I had collapsed the field. But at what cost? Major Harris and Corporal Jensen were slumped against a far wall, unconscious but, from what I could tell, alive. Riley, however, was dead. His body, which had been in a state of seizure, was now still, the psychic trauma of the field's collapse having finally, mercifully, ended his suffering. I was a leader who had lost one of his men. The victory, if it could be called that, was ashes in my mouth. The entity, the silence, was gone, but its ghost remained. The overt physical aggression was over, but a new, more subtle horror was just beginning. The bunker was no longer a cage of silence, but it was still a tomb. The main blast door was sealed, buckled and warped by the forces unleashed during the collapse. We were trapped, with no power, limited air, and no way to contact the outside world. The escalation now was a slow, grim battle for survival. We had to take stock of our hopeless situation. We found a supply of emergency rations and bottled water, enough for a few days if we were careful. The air filtration system was dead, meaning we were on a very finite supply of breathable air. We were 3 men, wounded and exhausted, sealed in a concrete box 20 miles from civilization, with no one in the world even knowing we were still alive. The direct, physical encounter that followed was not with an anomaly, but with our own dwindling hope. For days, we worked. We tried to clear the debris. We tried to find a way to manually unseal the blast door. But it was hopeless. The mechanism was fused, the steel warped beyond repair. The silence of our tomb was broken only by the sound of our own labored breathing and the steady, rhythmic clang of a hammer against unyielding steel as Harris, in a grim, desperate ritual, tried to break through a wall. It was a futile gesture, a man trying to punch his way through a mountain, but it was all he had left. He was a man of action, and the inability to act was its own kind of torture. The cliffhanger, the moment of complete despair that crystallized into a final, cold resolve, came on the 4th day. Our air was growing thin and stale. A thick, coppery taste was a constant presence in our mouths. We were weak, dizzy, our movements slow and sluggish. We knew we were dying. We were sitting in the near darkness, our flashlight batteries almost dead, and Jensen, the young corporal, began to speak. His voice was a weak, fluttering thing. I can't breathe, sir," he wheezed. "It's so quiet." And then he began to laugh. A soft, strange, bubbling laugh that was more terrifying than any scream. "It's still here," he whispered, his eyes wide and unfocused. "The quiet. It's inside my head. I can still feel it." He'd lost his mind. The psychic echo of the silence, the trauma of what he had endured, had finally broken him. He curled into a ball on the floor, laughing and weeping in the darkness. Harris and I were left alone. 2 rational men trapped in a tomb with a madman breathing our last few hours of air. It was in that moment of absolute bottomless despair that I looked at the molten ruin of the main console, and I remembered. The tape. The reel of magnetic tape that I had taken from the recorder. I had tucked it into a pouch on my suit. In the chaos, I had forgotten it. I pulled it out. It was my last, desperate, and most insane idea. But it was all I had left. I wasn't going to run anymore. I was going to broadcast. The decision to broadcast was the last, desperate gamble of a dying man. My lair was not a physical place, but the very theory that had gotten us into this mess. The lair was my own creation, the inverted physics of the silence. My desperate preparation for this final confrontation was a frantic, feverish scramble in the foul, oxygen-starved air of the bunker. "Harris," I rasped, my voice a dry, cracking thing. "Help me. We need to build a transmitter." He looked at me as if I were as mad as Jensen, who was still muttering to himself in a dark corner. "A transmitter, Doc?" Harris wheezed, his own breathing labored. "With what? We have no power. We have nothing." "We have the tape," I said, holding up the 5-inch reel. "This tape isn't a recording. It's a battery. It absorbed the energy of the field for 65 years. It's saturated with it. If I can build a crude induction coil, I might be able to draw that energy out. And if I can do that, I can power a small, short-range broadcaster." It was a theory based on a dozen cascading assumptions, a house of cards built on a foundation of pure hope. But it was the only blueprint I had left. The journey into this lair was an intellectual one, a frantic race against our own asphyxiation. We began to salvage what we could from the ruined bunker. We were like 2 dying astronauts, cannibalizing their own dead ship for parts. We gathered lengths of copper wire from the walls. We broke open one of the few intact pieces of monitoring equipment and scavenged its vacuum tubes and capacitors. My hands were clumsy, my mind thick and slow from the lack of oxygen. But the familiar methodical process of building something, of engineering a solution, was a powerful anchor in the swirling chaos of my despair. The journey was a terrifying gauntlet against our own bodies. Every movement was an effort. A simple walk across the bunker would leave us gasping for air, our hearts hammering, black spots dancing in our vision. Harris, a man I had seen carry a 200-pound piece of equipment half a mile without breaking a sweat, was now winded after prying a single panel off a console. We were living on borrowed time, each breath a precious, finite resource. The entity we were fighting now was not the silence, but the simple, unforgiving math of our own biology. The final guardian we had to face before reaching the heart of the lair was a puzzle of pure, desperate ingenuity. I had managed to construct a crude but functional induction coil around the reel of tape. I had built a simple, low-power oscillator circuit, but I had no antenna. The bunker's main antenna was on the surface, 100 feet above us, an impossible distance away. We needed something, anything, to broadcast a signal. For hours we searched the ruined bunker, our flashlight beams growing dimmer and dimmer. And then, Harris found it. It was so obvious, so simple that we had overlooked it completely. It was the logbook, the one O'Connell's technician had been writing in. "The binding, Doc," Harris said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The spiral binding. It's steel wire." It was a long shot, a ridiculous long shot, but it was our only shot. We carefully, painstakingly, unthreaded the steel wire from the logbook spine. It was a single, continuous piece of metal, maybe 10 feet long. It was our message in a bottle, our final, desperate flare. The cliffhanger, the moment we reached the final door, was the moment I connected the last wire. I had my crude transmitter, powered by the impossible energy stored in the magnetic tape, its signal to be broadcast by a piece of wire from a dead man's notebook. I didn't know what I would broadcast. A distress call? A warning? And then I realized the tape wasn't just a battery. It was a recording of the silence itself, the very energy pattern that had created this hell. My plan was to not just send a signal, but to send a sample, to broadcast the monster's own fingerprint out into the world. It was a truly catastrophic idea. If I was wrong, it would do nothing. If I was right, it could potentially recreate the zone of silence wherever the signal was received. It was a suicide mission that could take the rest of the world with it. I paused, my hand hovering over the switch I had fashioned from 2 pieces of copper. I looked at Harris. His face was pale and slick with sweat in the dying light, but his eyes were clear. He knew the risk. He knew the stakes. And he gave me a final, slow nod. I took a deep, rattling breath of the foul, thin air, and I activated the switch. The act ended as the vacuum tubes in my crude device began to glow with a faint, sickly purple light. The steel wire of the binding began to hum, a low, almost inaudible vibration that I felt more in my teeth than my ears. The air around us began to shimmer again. The monster was awake, and I had just given it a voice. The purple glow from the vacuum tubes of my makeshift transmitter was the beginning of the end. The low hum from the spiral wire antenna was the monster's first faint whisper. We were not in a lair. We had built one. The rich, terrifying description of the entity's true presence was not something we saw, but something we felt. The air in the bunker, already thin and toxic, became thick, heavy, and charged with a strange, static energy. The faint, psychic pressure of the silence began to return, a soft, probing touch against the inside of my skull. My crude device was working. It was drawing the stored energy from the tape and broadcasting it, converting it back into the very field that had trapped us. I had not created a distress call. I had created a homing beacon for a predator that lived in the space between sounds. The ultimate confrontation was a silent, internal battle against the returning field. As the hum from the antenna grew stronger, so did the psychic pressure. It was different this time. It was not the overwhelming, chaotic agony of the field's collapse. It was a focused, intelligent, and deeply personal assault. The silence was no longer just a physical phenomenon. It knew us now. It had tasted our minds, and it was using our own thoughts, our own fears, against us. It began to show me images, not on a screen, but projected directly onto the canvas of my mind's eye. It showed me my equations on the blackboard at Los Alamos, the beautiful, elegant numbers twisting into demonic, mocking symbols. It showed me the triumphant, smiling faces of the generals in the control room, their applause now a silent, jeering mockery. It was weaponizing my pride, my arrogance, my greatest professional achievement, and turning it into a source of profound, soul-crushing shame. It was showing me that my beautiful theory had been nothing but a key that had unlocked a cage that had been holding something ancient and terrible. It was Harris who saved me. He saw the look on my face, the unfocused stare of a man lost in a waking nightmare. He moved with a slowness that must have cost him dearly, and he put his hand on my shoulder. The simple, physical, human touch was enough to break the psychic assault. I gasped, my mind snapping back to the horrifying reality of the bunker. "It's talking to me," I wheezed. "It's in my head." Harris just nodded, his own face a mask of grim determination. "Fight it, Doc," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Whatever it's showing you, it's not real." And it was in that moment of shared human defiance that the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, the ultimate revelation, was made clear. The signal from my transmitter, the broadcast of the silence, was not just radiating outward. It was also creating a feedback loop. And on a dusty, forgotten oscilloscope that had somehow survived the initial blast, a single green line began to trace a pattern. It was a weak signal, but it was there. It was the voice of the silence itself, made visible. And it was not a chaotic waveform of static. It was a structured, complex, and repeating signal, a language. And as I stared at that glowing green line, the final, world-shattering truth hit me. The silence was not an absence. It was a presence. The weapon hadn't torn a hole in reality. It hadn't inverted the physics of sound. It had done something far, far worse. It had acted as a catalyst, a key. It had unlocked a pre-existing state of being. The silence, this acoustic vacuum, was not a new creation. It was the original, native state of the universe. The primordial quiet that existed before the Big Bang, before sound, before vibration, before existence as we know it. We hadn't created a monster. We had opened a door back to a state of perfect, absolute, and sentient nothingness. And that nothingness was now aware of our noisy, chaotic, vibrant little pocket of existence. The project hadn't failed. It had succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. It had given us a glimpse of the face of God. And the face of God was a silent, empty void. Armed with this final, terrible knowledge, I knew what I had to do. My final, sacrificial act was not to overload a reactor or trigger a self-destruct. It was to close the door. My crude transmitter was holding the door open. It was sustaining the connection to the primordial silence. I had to destroy it. But if I did, our only hope of rescue, our only way of making a noise that the outside world might detect, would be gone. It was a choice between our own certain deaths and the potential existential threat to the entire universe. And it was not a choice at all. In a last, desperate surge of adrenaline, I lurched forward. The story ends at the absolute peak of this action. I grabbed a heavy, metal fire extinguisher from the wall. The movement was a roaring, kinetic explosion in the returning field, and a wave of pure, white-hot agony tore through my skull. But I didn't stop. I raised the extinguisher high above my head, a final, defiant act of a noisy, messy, and gloriously imperfect humanity, and I brought it down, with all my remaining strength, onto the glowing vacuum tubes of my creation. A blinding, silent flash of purple light. A deafening, silent roar of psychic feedback. A wave of force that felt like the universe itself snapping shut. Then abrupt, total silence and darkness. The narrative cuts off completely, leaving my fate and the fate of the world completely, terrifyingly unknown. My return was not to a hospital bed or a debriefing room. It was to the mundane, rhythmic clatter of helicopter blades. I awoke to the sensation of being gently rocked, the smell of aviation fuel and sweat, and the sight of the cracked, sun-bleached dashboard of a military Huey. I was strapped into a stretcher, an IV line snaking into my arm. A young Army medic was leaning over me, his face a mask of professional concern. "Easy there, sir," he said, his voice loud, booming, almost painful in its normality. "You're okay. We've got you." I tried to speak, but my throat was a desert, my voice a dry, rasping croak. "Harris? Jensen?" I managed to whisper. The medic's face tightened, his professional mask slipping for a moment to reveal a deep, human pity. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice soft. "You were the only one we found alive." The story they pieced together, the official narrative, was that a long-range listening post had picked up a strange, repeating, low-energy radio signal from the middle of the declared sacrifice zone. A signal that wasn't supposed to be there. A rescue team was dispatched. They found the main blast door of Delta 4 buckled and warped, and they had to use explosive charges to get inside. They found a scene of devastation. 2 dead men, Harris and Riley, and 1 man, Jensen, who had died of asphyxiation. And they found me, unconscious, lying next to the burned-out ruin of a bizarre, homemade device. My survival was a miracle, they said. A 1-in-a-million shot. The official explanation was that I had managed to build a crude radio and that my distress call had been heard. They never questioned it. They didn't want to. It was a good story. A story of heroism and survival. It was a much better story than the truth. My debriefing was a quiet, civilized affair. It took place a month later, after I had recovered my physical strength, in a comfortable wood-paneled office at the Pentagon. The men I faced were not soldiers or lawyers. They were old men in expensive suits, the quiet, unelected cardinals of the Atomic Energy Commission, and the deep state. They already knew everything. They had my report from the bunker, the pages filled with my feverish, oxygen-starved handwriting. They had the reel of tape, which they now handled with a reverence usually reserved for a holy relic. The horror they expressed was not supernatural, but chillingly pragmatic. They weren't horrified that I had opened a door to a sentient void of nothingness. They were horrified that I had proven it could be done. They did not threaten me. They did not need to. They simply laid out the new reality of my life. I was a national hero, they said. The man who had survived the unfortunate Tacit incident. My name, Samuel Bellamy, would be etched into the history of the AEC. But the real Samuel Bellamy, the man who had looked into the void, was to be buried. I was given a new identity, a quiet, academic life, far from the world of physics and weapons design. They told me the zone of silence, the area around Delta 4, had been declared a permanent national sacrifice zone, off limits to all personnel for eternity. They had learned their lesson. They had opened a door they couldn't close, and now they were simply going to wall off the entire wing of the house and pretend it didn't exist. The official report, a document that would be classified for 100 years, blamed the entire incident on the unexpected development of an experimental nerve agent that was a byproduct of the detonation. Mass hysteria, equipment malfunction, a neat, tidy, and utterly complete lie. And now, I jump forward 65 years to this quiet, sun-drenched apartment in Arizona, to an old man with a tremor in his hand, writing down a truth that the world has forgotten. The long-term psychological scars are unique. I'm not paranoid. I'm not haunted by ghosts. I'm haunted by their absence. I'm haunted by silence. I cannot bear a quiet room. I keep a radio playing at all times, a constant stream of talk, of music, of meaningless, beautiful human noise. It is a shield against the memory of the true quiet. I'm unable to form deep relationships because at the heart of every interaction, I'm aware of the vast, silent void that separates all of us, the fundamental nothingness that our noisy lives are built upon. I look at the world, at the bustling cities, the shouting crowds, the roaring engines, and I see it all as a thin, fragile film of vibration, stretched taut over an infinite, patient, and listening abyss. I'm a ghost in my own species, a man who has heard the sound of the universe holding its breath. I'm putting down my pen now. This is the end of my story. I have written it all down. A final, defiant act of noise against the encroaching silence of my own death. I've told this story not for absolution, but for a warning. The warning is not that we built a weapon that was too powerful. The warning is that we built a key, and we found a lock we didn't know existed. And the most terrifying secret, the one that keeps me awake in the noisy, artificial night, is that we still have copies of that key. The equations for the Morpheus device for my beautiful, terrible implosion lens are sitting in a vault somewhere. And someday, another young, arrogant scientist, a man just like I was, will look at them, and he will see not a weapon, but a work of art. And he will want to test his theory. And he may not be as lucky as we were. He may open the door, and this time, we may not be able to close it again. They gave me a new name, a new life, and told me to forget the silence. But I can't. Because sometimes, when the world gets very, very quiet, late at night, in the brief, silent space between one sound and the next, I can still feel it listening. So that's the story of the Zone of Silence. A story that reminds us that the most terrifying weapon is not one that makes a loud noise, but one that takes all the noise away, leaving behind only the profound, awful quiet of what comes after. It proves that our entire, vibrant, chaotic world is just a thin, fragile bubble of sound, floating in an ocean of silence we would be wise not to disturb. The official story is that the Tasset incident was a chemical accident. But now you and I know the truth. They didn't just test a bomb. They knocked on the door of the void, and for a terrifying moment, the void answered back. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think, or look over your shoulder, support the channel with a like and subscribe, and be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, cherish the noise, cherish the chaos. Because the silence that follows is eternal, and it is always, always listening.